When we look back at history, there are moments that unsettle us, not because of the grand wars or the sweeping political changes, but because of the deeply personal human tragedies that lie hidden beneath the crowns and thrones. One such story is that of a little girl, only 6 years old, who became the wife of a king almost 5 times her age. She was a child in every sense of the word, innocent, unformed, still learning the language of play and the rhythms of childhood. Yet history placed her in the cold and unfamiliar role of a queen. The man she was married to was 29 years old, a fully grown adult, a ruler who wielded power, respect, and command. Their marriage was not a union of love or even companionship, but rather a transaction, a political arrangement that reveals the darker truths about power, gender, and the sacrifices demanded of the powerless. In many monarchies throughout history, marriages were never simply personal matters. They were political tools, designed to secure alliances, strengthen dynasties, and consolidate influence. For kings, queens, and nobles, marriage was rarely about affection. It was about survival in a world where power was fragile, constantly threatened by rivals, and easily lost to conspiracies. In this world, even children could become pawns, their lives mapped out long before they were old enough to understand what marriage even meant. The young girl in this story is one such pawn. She was taken from her family, dressed in fine clothes she could hardly carry, and placed beside a king as his bride. The image is haunting. A grown man with the world at his command, and at his side, a fragile child who should have been playing with toys rather than holding court as a queen. To truly understand the gravity of her fate, one must remember what being 6 years old means. At 6, most children are barely learning to read and write. They are curious about the world, but their sense of it is still innocent, uncorrupted by the complexities of adult life. A child of that age laughs at simple games, cries when scolded, and clings to her parents for reassurance. Yet in her case, those tender years were stolen. Her identity was reshaped to fit a crown that never belonged to her, and her childhood disappeared behind the heavy doors of palaces and the unyielding expectations of royal duty. The king who married her was not unusual in his time. Across centuries, rulers often wed very young girls, sometimes even before they had entered adolescence. It was not considered strange for kings to take brides who were little more than children, because the system valued bloodlines over human dignity. For the ruler, such a marriage could bring prestige, cement alliances with powerful families, or ensure loyalty from noble houses. But for the girl, the consequences were devastating. She was placed into a role that demanded maturity she could not possibly have, a role that subjected her to scrutiny, pressure, and expectations that weighed heavier than her small body could bear. The reality of such marriages cannot be softened. While official documents may record them in sterile terms, the king took a wife of noble birth, or a marriage was contracted to strengthen the alliance. Behind those words lies a human being whose life was irreversibly altered. A child like her might have been groomed from the moment the marriage was announced. She would be told how to walk, how to sit, how to speak with dignity. Her toys may have been taken from her, replaced with jewels and silks that she did not understand. Servants would address her with titles, but those titles were empty in her ears, meaningless to a girl who still yearned for the comfort of her mother's lap. And then there was the man she was married to, the king, 29 years old with responsibilities that stretched far beyond her comprehension. He was a figure of authority, someone who had already lived through decades of experience, war, politics, and intrigue. In his world, a wife was an asset, a queen was a symbol, and the fact that she was a child did not matter. She was not expected to be a partner in the modern sense. She was expected to be obedient, to eventually provide heirs, and to symbolize purity and loyalty to the throne. What she felt, or what she feared, was of little concern to those around her. Imagine the wedding itself. It would have been a grand occasion, attended by nobles, priests, and dignitaries. The halls would have been filled with music, the air heavy with incense, and the eyes of an entire court fixed upon the tiny figure in her ceremonial garments. Perhaps she did not even fully understand what was happening. Perhaps she thought it was another one of the celebrations she had occasionally witnessed, not realizing that this day marked the end of her childhood. She may have cried silently, or she may have looked around with wide, confused eyes, searching for a familiar face among the strangers. And beside her, the king would stand tall and commanding, aware of the symbolism but detached from the human cost. This was not just the tragedy of one girl. It was the tragedy of countless children across history who were forced into adult roles long before their time, whether in palaces, noble houses, or even common families in different cultures. Child marriage has existed as a practice that robs innocence and reshapes lives into burdens too heavy to carry. Her story stands as a reflection of this broader reality, one that reminds us how fragile childhood has always been when confronted with the demands of power and tradition. Underneath the glittering surface of this political marriage, there was a disturbing silence, one that speaks volumes about how little the feelings of a child mattered in a world dominated by dynasties and thrones. The little girl, still at an age where most would be learning to tie their shoes or sing simple songs, was thrust into an environment that demanded obedience, discipline, and restraint. Imagine her sitting in a vast hall, the ceilings soaring above her, surrounded by adults who bowed and spoke in whispers of strategy and power. Every word and gesture around her was calculated, but she herself remained lost in a haze of incomprehension. She was not yet old enough to grasp the meaning of duty, nor the mechanics of politics, yet those forces had already claimed her life entirely. What must it have been like for her when the celebrations ended and the reality of her new life began? The palace, with all its grandeur, could easily feel like a prison to someone so small. The marble corridors, the echo of footsteps, the endless ceremonies, all of it towering over her fragile sense of self. She was expected to behave with grace, to carry herself like a queen, yet her natural instincts as a child would have been at odds with these expectations. She might have wanted to run, to play, to laugh loudly, but every action would be met with correction. Tutors, attendants, and governesses would surround her, shaping her into the image of a queen long before her heart and mind could mature into that role. The king, meanwhile, lived in a reality completely separate from hers. At 29, he was in the prime of adulthood, a man who had already seen battles, intrigue, and the weight of responsibility. His court expected him to maintain authority, to project power, and to command respect. His marriage to the young girl was less about companionship and more about optics, an act designed to strengthen his political standing. While she struggled to understand why she was suddenly treated as a wife, he carried on with the burdens of rule, often detached from her confusion. In his world, this was not unusual. History had normalized such arrangements. A man's duty to his dynasty outweighed any moral hesitation about the youth of his bride. The girl's family likely played a role in orchestrating this marriage, a decision driven not by affection but by ambition and survival. For her parents, marrying their daughter to a king meant elevation, wealth, and security. They may have convinced themselves that it was a privilege, a blessing to be chosen for the royal family. But one can only wonder if, in the quiet of the night, her mother wept for the daughter she would barely see again, or if her father questioned the innocence they had sacrificed for prestige. To them, perhaps it was a calculated sacrifice, but to the child, it was a theft of everything she had known. There is a cruel irony in how such marriages were framed. Chroniclers and courtiers would write of them in glowing terms. A noble union, a strengthening of the realm, a divine blessing upon the kingdom. Yet the language masked the human cost. What these records failed to mention was the fear in the child's eyes, the trembling of her small hands, the loneliness she endured in unfamiliar chambers. To her, the crown was not a symbol of glory. It was a weight she could neither understand nor escape. Over time, she would have been taught her responsibilities. Tutors would lecture her on the importance of bearing herself with dignity. Priests might have spoken to her about her duty to God and King. Court officials would remind her of her role as a symbol of virtue, purity, and loyalty. But how could a child embody such concepts? How could she possibly internalize virtues that require maturity and self-awareness when her mind was still developing, her emotions still untamed? The disconnect between expectation and reality is staggering, and it underscores the profound injustice of her situation. It is possible, too, that she lived with fear, not just of the king, but of the entire institution surrounding him. At any moment, her behavior could be scrutinized. A misstep, a childish outburst, even a refusal to sit still, could be interpreted as a lack of discipline or respect. In such an environment, fear would have been her constant companion, slowly replacing the natural joy and curiosity of childhood with caution and silence. She may have grown quiet, withdrawn, retreating into herself because the world outside demanded a version of her that she could not become. And yet, within this tragic framework, we must not forget her humanity. She was not just a symbol or a pawn. She was a little girl with thoughts and feelings of her own. Perhaps she clung to a favorite toy or doll, hiding it under her bedding as a secret reminder of the life she once had. Perhaps she found small comfort in the company of a kind servant who spoke to her gently, or in the fleeting moments when she was allowed to wander a garden and touch the flowers. These tiny fragments of normalcy may have been the only sparks of light in an otherwise suffocating existence. For the king, this marriage may have been nothing more than another step in his reign. For the court, it was a spectacle of power and prestige. But for the girl, it was the end of innocence. Her story reminds us that history is not just a collection of grand events and noble titles. It is also the accumulation of personal lives, often broken or reshaped by forces they could not resist. And while the records may gloss over her suffering, her silence echoes across time, a haunting reminder of how power can crush the most vulnerable. As the years passed, the girl inevitably began to grow, though the shadow of her childhood loss remained. Puberty arrived with all its confusion and intensity, yet in her case, it was compounded by the unnatural circumstances of her life. Her body began to mature while her mind was still haunted by the memories of innocence stolen too soon. The transition from child to adolescent was not accompanied by freedom or exploration. Instead, it was marked by the ever-present expectations of court life and the looming reality of her marriage. She was no longer simply a child, yet she had never truly experienced what it meant to be one. Her identity, shaped by a world that demanded obedience over understanding, left her with a fractured sense of self. The king, by this time, may have regarded her differently than when she was 6. Her growing maturity meant that she could finally fulfill the biological and symbolic roles he had long anticipated. She was expected to provide heirs, to cement alliances, and to embody the ideals of royalty. Yet even as she aged, the power imbalance remained stark. No matter how intelligent or capable she became, she was still tied to a man who had entered adulthood years before her, whose experiences, ambitions, and authority far surpassed her own. Her consent, in any modern sense, was irrelevant. Her life continued to revolve around the mechanisms of a system that had chosen her as a tool, not as an equal. In those early years, the girl may have sought small rebellions, tiny acts of defiance to reclaim even a sliver of autonomy. Perhaps she refused certain lessons, spoke out of turn, or sought solace in hidden corners of the palace gardens. Each act of independence, though minute, would have been a way for her to assert the humanity that the institution of monarchy had attempted to erase. Yet such gestures were risky. In a court where every movement was observed, even a fleeting moment of perceived disobedience could be punished, corrected, or quietly suppressed. These small rebellions, therefore, were often private, hidden from the prying eyes of servants and officials, existing only in her imagination or secret journals if she had the chance to write. The psychological consequences of such an upbringing cannot be overstated. Living under constant scrutiny with responsibilities far beyond her age would shape her perceptions of self-worth and autonomy. She might have learned early on that her value lay not in who she was as a person, but in how well she fulfilled the roles imposed upon her. Fear and obedience could easily replace curiosity and joy. Emotional development could be stunted by the perpetual weight of expectation, and trust might become a scarce commodity, given that nearly everyone in her world viewed her not as a child, but as an extension of political ambition. In historical accounts of such child brides, one often finds a tension between public perception and private reality. To the outside world, she was a queen, regal and dignified, performing ceremonies and fulfilling her duties. To those who knew the truth, the servants who witnessed her tears, the rare confidants who offered comfort, she remained a child at heart, struggling to navigate a life that had been thrust upon her. This duality between appearance and reality was one she would carry for the rest of her life. The mask of royalty covered the vulnerability of her youth, yet it could not erase the memories of what had been taken from her. Despite the overwhelming circumstances, it is also possible that she developed resilience, a quiet strength born of necessity. The palace could be cruel, but it could also teach adaptability, strategic thinking, and emotional control. She learned to navigate court politics, to understand the expectations of those around her, and to manage her image with precision. In some ways, the very hardships that had been forced upon her may have fostered skills that later allowed her to exert influence, albeit within a tightly constrained framework. Survival in such an environment required a combination of intelligence, patience, and emotional fortitude that few children or adults could summon. Yet the cost of this adaptation was profound. The child she had once been, the one who laughed freely, explored her surroundings without fear, and dreamed in uncomplicated ways, was buried beneath layers of imposed maturity and survival instinct. Memories of her early years could surface only in quiet, fleeting moments, perhaps triggered by a familiar song, a soft breeze through the palace gardens, or a fleeting reflection in a mirror. In those moments, the gap between the life she had lost and the life she had been forced to live would become unbearably clear. And so, the girl's story is one of contradiction. It is a tale of suffering and resilience, innocence lost and strength gained, humanity overshadowed by the machinery of power, yet quietly asserting itself through acts of private courage. While history may remember her primarily as a queen, the truth is far more complex. She was a child, a victim, and ultimately a survivor of circumstances that were never of her own making. Her life reminds us that behind every title and ceremony, there can be hidden stories of vulnerability, endurance, and the unacknowledged costs of political ambition. As the girl reached her teenage years, the pressures of her role intensified. The court, which had watched her growth with careful eyes, now expected her to fully embody the responsibilities of a queen. Every gesture, every word, every choice was scrutinized. Etiquette became a form of armor, a way to shield herself from criticism, and to maintain some semblance of control over a life largely dictated by others. Yet beneath the layers of poise and protocol, she remained acutely aware of the childhood she had lost, a consciousness that must have made every royal ceremony both a triumph and a torment. Her relationship with the king, who was now a seasoned adult, remained complicated. Though society may have portrayed their marriage as harmonious, the reality was likely far more complex. He may have treated her with kindness or indifference, even mentorship, but the fundamental imbalance could not be erased. No matter his behavior, the gap in age, experience, and authority persisted, shaping interactions in ways that were subtle yet profound. Emotional intimacy, in the sense we understand today, was nearly impossible, for she had never been given the opportunity to grow alongside him as an equal partner might. Instead, she navigated a dynamic that demanded respect, obedience, and appearances, leaving little room for genuine personal connection. Amid the ceremonial life of the palace, moments of solitude became precious. Perhaps she wandered into hidden courtyards, traced the stone paths with her fingers, or found a quiet nook in the library where she could escape the endless eyes and expectations. These private moments allowed her to cling to fragments of identity that were not defined by her role as queen. She may have revisited memories of her family, toys, or childhood games, holding on to these mental refugees as evidence that she was still human, still herself, despite the overwhelming demands of her environment. The political responsibilities of her position loomed larger as she matured. By adolescence, she was expected to participate in diplomatic audiences, understand the nuances of alliances, and embody the ideals of her kingdom in every interaction. She became a symbol of legitimacy, a living emblem of continuity for the monarchy. Every smile, every curtsy, every word she spoke reinforced the narrative crafted by those around her, that she was the perfect queen, the embodiment of grace and loyalty. Yet behind the symbol was a young woman who had not chosen this life, a life imposed on her when she could barely comprehend its significance. Historical accounts of child brides often reveal how isolation compounded the difficulty of their existence. Friendships with peers were rare, as she existed in a world governed by adults bound by rules and ceremonies. Conversations were measured, interactions monitored, and her free expression curtailed. In this sense, loneliness was both constant and profound. She may have observed children playing outside palace walls with a mixture of longing and sorrow, reminded daily of the ordinary experiences of youth that were forever beyond her reach. Despite these challenges, it is possible that the girl's resilience deepened during this period. The skills she had developed, discretion, intelligence, strategic thinking, allowed her to navigate court politics with increasing sophistication. She may have formed alliances with sympathetic courtiers, learned to read the subtle language of power, and discovered ways to exert influence within the narrow confines of her prescribed role. Such adaptability became a survival mechanism, a way to maintain agency in a life structured around control and expectation. Yet the psychological and emotional toll of her upbringing cannot be ignored. Being thrust into a position of immense responsibility before one's emotional and cognitive maturity can leave lasting scars. Anxiety, self-doubt, and a perpetual sense of vigilance may have become lifelong companions. Even as she gained power and influence in certain areas, she carried with her the weight of lost childhood, a foundational absence that shaped every subsequent experience. The juxtaposition of her external authority and internal vulnerability created a complex inner life, one rarely visible to historians or courtiers. Her story, while extreme in its particulars, echoes broader truths about the human cost of power structures throughout history. The mechanisms of monarchy, nobility, and political alliance often prioritized strategy over compassion, leaving children and young women particularly vulnerable. The little girl who became a queen at 6 endured a lifetime of adaptation, negotiation, and survival. Her personal development continually interrupted by expectations she could never have imagined as a child. Through it all, there is a sense of tragic endurance. The girl, though transformed by circumstance, retained a spark of the child she once was. Moments of private reflection, fleeting joy, and small acts of autonomy allowed her to preserve a sense of self, however constrained. In the grand narrative of history, her life may be noted for the titles she held and the alliances she cemented. But in the human story, it is her resilience, her courage, and her quiet suffering that speak most profoundly across the centuries. As she entered adulthood, the girl, once a 6-year-old bride, had become a young woman fully ensnared in the complexities of royal life. Her body had matured, and with it came the full expectations of her role, producing heirs, managing the household, representing the crown, and upholding the image of the monarchy in every public and private interaction. Yet despite the appearance of strength and authority, her personal history, the theft of her childhood, the imposition of adult responsibilities long before she was ready, continued to shape every decision and interaction. Every smile she offered in court, every word she spoke during diplomatic affairs carried the invisible weight of years lived under coercion and expectation. By now, she may have found certain ways to assert herself within the palace. While she could not escape the structures imposed upon her, she could influence subtleties, advising on ceremonial matters, selecting her own attendants, or gently guiding junior courtiers and servants. These small exertions of agency, though seemingly minor in the grand political scheme, allowed her to reclaim fragments of autonomy in a life largely dictated by others. They may have also offered her a sense of identity that was her own, separate from the role of queen assigned to her at 6 years old. Yet even as she navigated these subtleties, the psychological echoes of her early life remained ever present. The girl she had been, the one who laughed freely, played without caution, and approached the world with innocence, was buried beneath layers of learned composure, obedience, and strategy. Emotional development, which normally occurs gradually and naturally through experience and reflection, had been forced and accelerated, leaving gaps that could never fully be healed. Relationships were complicated by this history. Trust was difficult, intimacy fraught, and friendships rare. Those who had not endured similar circumstances could never truly understand the tension between outward poise and inner vulnerability that defined her existence. The king, meanwhile, continued to occupy a position of authority over her, though their relationship had likely evolved into a complex blend of obligation, distance, and perhaps limited affection. By adulthood, she could participate more fully in the political life of the court, and perhaps the king came to value her counsel or presence in certain situations. But the fundamental power imbalance, rooted in the age difference, in societal norms, and in the history of her coerced youth, remained immutable. She was always, in some sense, playing a role she had never consented to, even as she mastered its performance. Her story also reflects the broader societal structures that allowed such situations to exist. Child brides, particularly in positions of political significance, were not anomalies. They were instruments of statecraft. Their lives were shaped to serve dynasties and political strategies rather than individual well-being. Education, appearance, and demeanor were cultivated meticulously to serve the interests of the court and family, often at the expense of personal growth and emotional health. In this context, her resilience becomes all the more remarkable. Despite systematic suppression of her childhood and autonomy, she survived and adapted, navigating a world designed to constrain her. Despite the oppression, she may have found moments of genuine human connection, friendships with attendants, confidences shared with sympathetic members of the court, or even fleeting moments of joy in private gardens or quiet rooms. These moments, small though they were, served as reminders of her humanity and individuality. They allowed her to reclaim pieces of her inner life, fragments of freedom and self-expression that were denied to her in the early years of her marriage. As history records her life, it often focuses on titles, alliances, and ceremonial appearances. But a closer examination reveals a narrative of endurance, psychological complexity, and the hidden costs of political expedience. She lived with the memory of a stolen childhood, yet she developed strategies to survive, to assert influence, and to maintain a sense of self within the rigid constraints of court life. Her story is both a cautionary tale and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. How an individual can endure circumstances beyond comprehension, navigate systemic oppression, and yet preserve fragments of identity and agency against overwhelming odds. In the final analysis, her life exemplifies the intersection of innocence lost and resilience gained. It reminds us that behind every royal title lies a human story, one often overshadowed by ceremony, power, and history's tendency to glorify appearances. The 6-year-old girl married to a 29-year-old king was more than a political instrument. She was a child robbed of her formative years, a young woman shaped by extraordinary circumstances, and ultimately a survivor whose endurance resonates across the centuries. The crown may have defined her public identity, but her personal story, the quiet struggle of her early life, and the strength she cultivated in response, is what truly endures in memory, a haunting, instructive, and profoundly human narrative that challenges us to reconsider what history chooses to remember.